We're getting started. My name is Jesse Sharkey. I'm the president of Chicago Teachers Union. We're really happy to be joined here by a great panel of rank and file activists and Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor from Princeton. But we claim her as a Chicagoan, we claim her as our own. And we're going to wait a couple minutes here for people to be finished getting on the meeting, and then we're going to get started. So thanks for joining us. Actually, while we're waiting for people to get on the webinar, maybe I'll just say a couple things quickly about how it's going to work. This is a Zoom webinar. There's been some issues with Zoom, so some of the features that have allowed, like Zoom bombing and other kind of disturbing things like that, have been disabled. The way it's going to work is that while the panelists are presenting, that'll be on your screen. You'll be presenting that. Then there's a big chunk of time in the middle toward the end of the meeting where people will be able to ask questions. In order to do that, you'll need to use the question and answer feature. And so depending whether you have a Mac or a PC, either on the bottom or the top of your screen, there'll be a place to type in question and answer, or Q&A. And if you type a question into that space, as time and space allows, we'll be taking some people from there and allowing you to go on the webinar and ask your question. So that's the way that's gonna function, and then we'll get into it. I will wait for a signal from a moderator, though. If it's time to start. Is it time to start? I'm asking Nate. Well, maybe I'll wait just another minute before getting into the meat of it. I guess I should also say that the CTU is, obviously we're the union that represents about 25,000 active teachers, paraprofessionals, clinicians, both in the Chicago public schools, but also in a number of charter schools across the city of Chicago. And at the heart of our union, there's a bunch of rank and file activists, people who work in classrooms, who work in schools, and they form committees. And one of the issues that we really spend a lot of time thinking about is housing. And so this event is sponsored by the Chicago Teachers Union's Rank and File Housing Committee. And we're going to be hearing a bunch from the folks who are part of that committee in a minute. So I think I'm going to get started with just by saying that housing is a really important issue in the CTU, partly because we understand the connection between our schools, our students, their parents, the communities that our schools are in. We don't view ourselves as an island or disconnected from our communities, but rather part of them. And when you go and you listen to people who live and work in the city of Chicago and ask folks what issues are most important, one of the things people often say is housing. It comes up again and again and again. So in the context of the strike, which we recently had in the fall of 2019, we put forward a series of demands about housing, and particularly access to housing, affordability for housing. And we did not win all of those demands, but we did win a couple of important demands, including funding for coordinators that work with homeless students in our schools. Of course, we won it after we were told that the mayor wouldn't bargain with us about it at all. So first we were told it was an outrageous and illegitimate thing to raise, and then there was something that we won there. We're also tracking that there's a piece of legislation in Illinois. So if you're from Illinois, please note that Representative Delia Ramirez has a housing bill which would provide rent and relief for rent, and also for small landlords to have some security for if they can't make mortgage payments as well. And so it continues to be something that we're really focusing on in this union, and that's kind of what this panel is going to be about. Again, during the course of the panel, if you've got a question, please use the question and answer feature on the webinar in order to get that question, and we'll be taking those as time allows later. I want to now pass the mic here to Christine Dussault, who is the rank and file chair of the CTU's Housing Committee, teacher. And Christine, take it away.
Thanks so much, Jesse. As Jesse stated, I'm Christine Dussault, housing chair. And I'm super excited about tonight's event. And I just want to share a little bit, just reiterate a little bit of what Jesse said about our housing committee and how we came to be. As stated, we did form about a year ago loosely when we were talking about our contract demands. And we had three main demands related to housing. These came about, as Jesse stated, from the massive displacement, particularly in our Black communities in the city of Chicago. And we were looking at teacher salaries for many of our paraprofessionals who couldn't even afford a 2-bedroom apartment in the city of Chicago. So we recognized we needed to ask more for housing for our students and families in our communities. So we asked, as Jesse stated, about our STLS students in temporary living situations. We asked for relief for teachers. We asked for relief for our students and their families. And although we were successful with the STLS, which was a huge, huge victory, we still feel that those other demands really brought to light a deep conversation about housing and how that intersects with schools. So we felt that using the discussion of our strike was a really pivotal moment for us. Since then, we've recognized that was just the beginning of our housing needs in the city of Chicago, and we formed an actual housing working group. And we have championed and worked alongside several coalitions, which you'll hear about a little bit later, and worked with legislators to help bring our members to some of the important housing bills and ordinances in our city and states. So we are thrilled to have this very special event tonight, and we hope the most important thing that I can say about our committee is the only way that we continue the advocacy for the work that we have is by joining our committee. We have a vision of having STLS liaisons in all of our schools and housing resource staff members that are equipped to help and advocate for our families whenever they need to. But we really need to build our committee to make that happen. So please join us. Our next meeting will be on May 27th at 4 p.m. And we really hope that we can continue to join this, grow this great committee. Thanks so much.
Had to find an unmute button. Thanks, Christine, for that. Let's get into it. We are really pleased tonight to be joined by Professor Yamahtta Taylor, Keeanga. To those of us who know her, who teaches at Princeton University, and I'm sure there's a lot of other kind of the way those universities work. There's many other nouns and adjectives that attach to your name. I'm not going to get them all right, but I will say this: that Keeanga is someone who I've known for a long time. Because she lived in Hyde Park in Chicago, was working her way through school, started at Northeastern, then went to Northwestern with a little stop in culinary school. And, I've known Keeanga as a person who's both a really skilled academic and a writer, but also someone who's been part of the social movements, and in particular part of the social movements in the city of Chicago for a long time. So Keeanga, welcome. We're really glad to have you.
Thank you very much. Really glad to be here and to talk about the issue of housing.
Cool. Well, we did a number of us. A shameless plug for your book, Race for Profit. Here,
there's always one nearby.
There you go. A number of us read the book and got a lot out of it. But it's not a precondition for being on the webinar. My guess is there's some people here who haven't had a chance to read it, although I hope you do. So I thought I'd kind of start the conversation really at a basic level, which is just like, anyone who's paid attention to housing and residential neighborhoods in the city of Chicago knows this is a segregated city. And I was hoping maybe you could keep it, start to start, which is talk a little bit about segregation and racism and the role that racism plays in housing in a city like Chicago.
Well, that's a long story that explains a lot about housing patterns in Chicago today, but also explains a lot about the kind of disproportionate levels of poverty, unemployment, really inequality experienced by African Americans in the city of Chicago. So in many ways, the patterns of residential segregation in Chicago became kind of templates for what happened elsewhere in the country. In the early 20th century, Chicago was an important destination for African Americans in the migration from the South to the North. And Chicago was also the headquarters of many of the important institutions in real estate and banking. So, for example, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, which was the parent trade organization for real estate brokers in the country, was headquartered in Chicago. And so as African Americans were moving into the city in the early 19-teens and into the 1920s, the University of Chicago's Department of Sociology was also narrating the migration of African Americans and introduced language like invasion, blight, to describe the influx of African Americans.
They've been at it for a long time, haven't they? University of Chicago.
And not to be outdone, the Chicago Tribune would also contribute to this narration. At one point in the early 1920s, they ran a headline that was paraphrased, "Darkies from Dixie swarm to Chicago for a better life." And so all of this is really kind of fueling and shaping public perceptions about what the movement of Black people into Chicago meant. And the real estate industry is paying attention. This is also a time of widespread theories about eugenics, and meaning the idea that there is a racial spectrum of inferiority to superiority. African Americans were certainly seen as an inferior race. And so the culmination of this was within real estate was to separate African Americans from white populations, so much so that by 1917, between 1917 and 1924, the National Association of Real Estate Board develops its rules and policies, one of which is that a real estate broker would lose their license if they introduced a person of a different race into an otherwise racially homogeneous neighborhood. And so that meant integration was then a professional liability if a real estate agent participated in that. And so you can imagine that this starts in the 19-teens, that really, you know, there's several tens of thousands of Black people move into Chicago by the early 1920s. The depression in the 30s kind of depresses migration, and then it picks up again in the post-war period of the 1940s. And so throughout these different waves, African Americans are being relegated to certain neighborhoods that they cannot move out of. And it's not, well, if I move out of this area, you know, perhaps I'll be uncomfortable, I'll miss my friends and family. No, if you try to breach the color line in Chicago, you may end up with a mob of white racists at your front door. Your house may be bombed. Your life would be endangered.
And the person who sold you the house could lose their license.
Correct. So the boundary lines are drawn quite hard. And the impact that this has in Black communities is the first one is that the housing is overcrowded. Landlords realize that African Americans are a captured market. And so there's no longer any incentive to maintain properties. The incentive now is to rent as much as possible. And so they begin to divide, subdivide, divide again properties to create as many apartments as possible. So one apartment that was intended for one family has now been split 2 or 3 ways, so that 2 or 3 different families are now living in this area. And so now there's overcrowding. The city is reluctant to maintain the same kinds of municipal services for African Americans. So now you have trash buildup, the streets are dirty. And instead of this being attributed to conditions imposed on Black people, at this point in the 1920s by the real estate industry, they are seen as attributes of the presence of Black people. And so these practices from real estate become hardened and entrenched when the federal government finally begins to develop housing policies for the country as a whole in the 1930s in the wake of the Depression. And so one of the things that the federal government does, and it always does, right, is whenever there's an attempt to create new policies, they go to private industry, private enterprise to recruit experts in the field. And so the experts in the field were real estate operatives from Chicago, many of whom are recruited from the real estate industry in Chicago into the federal government, into the newly formed Federal Housing Administration, to now take real estate practices that had been popularized in Chicago to now be generalized to the country as a whole. And part of that, yeah.
No, before you go on from this, I just want to like emphasize a point, which is, I mean, I think it's interesting, but you know, I've lived in Chicago for over 20 years. I didn't grow up here. My guess is that a lot of people who are on this webinar did, or you know, either lived in Chicago most of their lives or their whole lives. And it's one of the things about the city, which is that, like, you know, you notice it's extremely segregated, and yet it's very rare that we're actually told the reasons why, you know, why that developed beyond a kind of a broad sense that, oh, people like to live in different kind of neighborhoods.
Oh yeah, no, we're told reasons, but they're superficial reasons. They're not the root cause. So we're either told that Black people are too poor to live anywhere else than the West Side or South Side neighborhoods that they're concentrated in, or Black people just want to live around other African Americans. But what I'm looking at are the historical actions of, you know, both public policy and private institutions that culminated in the kind of racial geography that we understand. I mean, when I moved to Chicago in 1998, it was the first thing that struck me about the city. The first 2 things were, because I drove in from the east, was that once we got off of the expressway and we're driving up Stony Island, that it's all Black people for miles, you know, not, you know, this few streets here, like for miles. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was that all the Black people that I initially encountered had Southern accents. And so, because I grew up in Texas, and all of my family is from Tennessee. So the segregation in Chicago is real, and it's profound. But I did want to just make the quick point about public policy, because I began by talking about the practice
role of government,
of the private sector, and how those practices got mapped onto public policy, because the way that the state recruits from the private sector for its supposed expertise. And what that meant was not only were these policies entrenched and then generalized, but new policies were developed that now incentivize white people to leave cities. And so this relieved some of the housing pressure, which meant that African Americans had more housing choices as white people left. But as part of federal policy, Black neighborhoods are disinvested. So the federal government creates a homeownership plan that essentially makes homeownership cheap and available widely for the first time on the condition that the properties were new and that they were in racially homogeneous areas. And both of those essentially equated into white suburban housing being subsidized and insured and guaranteed by the federal government, while Black urban housing was left to essentially fend for itself. And it wasn't just big mortgage loans, it was also small home improvement loans. So African Americans are in neighborhoods that have much older housing, housing that is in disrepair, and are excluded from these programs that encourage and make homeownership widely available. And that really sets in stone the residential patterns that we see today, because that was the official policy.
You're talking about like
35 years.
You're talking about like Fannie Mae and sort of the big government subsidized.
Yeah. So
like,
the FHA,
you want to get a mortgage, you want, right?
The Federal Housing Administration, Fannie Mae, which buys the loans that are made by the FHA, so that banks don't have to, loans that are guaranteed by the FHA, so that banks don't just have to sit wait for a loan to be paid off over the course of its life. It means that there is liquidity within banks, that they have a constant cash flow because the federal government had a policy of buying those loans immediately back from banks. So this was a major turning point in the history of the United States.
Right. It's the whole look of like the suburbs and the after World War II, the all the kind of the wealthy, well-off white suburbs had big housing subsidies from the federal government to that.
Well, even if they were, because the Levittown, for example, which is a kind of quintessential suburban community that is built after the war, is not wealthy. It's actually a crappy little suburb that doesn't have public schools, in which there's, a 50-year fight to fully fund public education in Levittown. But they have houses which are assets, which people in Levittown are selling every 5 years to cash in on this accruing asset. And this is something that African Americans don't have access to. So when we talk about the intergenerational wealth gap, the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap that exists between African American people and white people. So the median wealth income or the median wealth for white families is something like $114,000, and for Black families is $11,000. And most of that differential can be understood in terms of whether you own a home or not. And also because of the way that Black communities and Black people have been devalued in this society, even when Black people own their own home, it's valued differently than for white people. And I always use Chicago as an example of this because I'm most familiar with it, which is to say that you can go to the 60653 zip code, which is essentially Bronzeville, where you have houses that are blocks away from the lake, many of which have been either completely flipped down to the studs or are new builds that are worth anywhere from $500,000 to $600,000. Those same houses 5 miles north are worth more than $1 million. What is the difference? One's in Bronzeville,
right.
One's in Lincoln Park. That's it. So even when Black people own homes, they're valued differently, meaning right. that they have a different impact on the lives of that family intergenerationally. And so this is really what is at the root of the kind of different set of life experiences for Black African Americans in the U.S.
So Keeanga, there's something that you talk about in your book, which I just like, I would be happy to keep having this conversation, but I'm going to try to like, get a few ideas in the mix, and then let people from the from the panel and the audience chip in. But you just were talking about the way that a period of like government intervention into public housing or supports for the housing market and whatnot shape a period of housing after World War II, going up kind of maybe into the mid 60s. But then there's a couple important things that happen. There's obviously like there's a civil rights movement, and then a series of big riots in American cities. There's these public-private partnerships that try to like address the question of conditions in the city, and then there's sort of a and you then use the term predatory inclusion to talk about like the conditions in the market that develop. What do you mean by predatory inclusion? Can you like talk a little bit about how like sort of like what's going on in the city housing markets?
Sure. So I use the framework of what I describe as predatory inclusion as a way to understand what happens when redlining finally ends. And so much of the kind of liberal discussion about race in the 1950s and 1960s is that, yes, we have a problem with racial inequality in the US. And what we need to do is create more opportunity and stop excluding people. And the premise is that the US is fine as long as we stop excluding people and just include people into the same institutions that created the white middle class, that then America can fulfill its larger promise. And so what I'm trying to essentially say about that is that premise assumes that there's no problem with the institutions of the United States, that the issue is one of exclusion. And if we simply include people, that those problems will disappear. And I reject that framing, which is to say that particularly with housing, that, one of the problems that Black people are immediately confronted with when redlining is ended and housing discrimination ends with the 1968 Fair Housing Act, is that nothing is done to actually repair the previous decades of racial exclusion and what the consequences of that were, which is if you have communities that have been disinvested from, where the housing is old and in disrepair, it has been overcrowded, city after city have neglected their responsibility for maintenance and for upkeep. And you stop that on Monday and say Tuesday, okay, everybody's free to go and be free and fairly involve themselves in the riches of U.S. society, is misleading and duplicitous. So for me, predatory inclusion was looking at how the conditions of the previous period of exclusion then in the post-fair housing world are turned into the new criteria that is used to designate these communities as subprime. And so that becomes the colorblind language that is used. They no longer say Black people are excluded. Black people, what they used to call Lawndale as a loss area, that these are areas that banks won't lend in because those are loss areas. Black people are too risky on the pure basis of being Black. Now they would say post-1968, well, the housing is old, so this is a risky investment. And if it's a risky investment, then we get to charge you higher interest rates, or we get to charge you other fees for your loans, or we won't lend to you at all. And we'll
Right.
let
Right. So it's like there's all these predatory practices that come dressed up looking like, concerned over the conditions of the inner city. You know, the life insurance folks, form a committee that's going to like help housing in the inner city and wind up, investing money.
Is that they did want more homeowners, right? The white housing market had been saturated by the early 1960s. For the most part, most of the white people who could be homeowners, who were going to be homeowners, were homeowners. And so this was a very lucrative business. So let's find some new homeowners on the condition that it's segregated, that segregation is maintained, because we don't want Black homeowners in white neighborhoods bringing down the property values in the minds of the bankers and public policy, public officials who sign off on this. We want to keep the housing markets separate. We will allow for Black people to buy their own homes, but as long as it is on a segregated basis. But since they can no longer say that, then they use other criteria. The condition of neighborhood, your quote unquote credit score, which has nothing to do with your race, except that all of the information is derived from the experiences of race that African Americans incur, employment, opportunity, the capacity to pay one's bills on time. Those are all factored by race.
Right. And then of course, like shoddy building practices, pawning off of complete substandard, properties. There's actually a story about Kanye West and his childhood home, and which has now been, he's trying to buy it back and fix it up and
turn it into a museum to him.
Well, there's that. But even his mom apparently had bought a house that was totally substandard, and this then was, while he's in the middle of fixing it up, was condemned.
Yep.
So
no, there were there's a whole other history of Chicago housing that Beryl Satter uncovered really in a very popular book called Family Properties, that the story about contract buying that Ta-Nehisi Coates then picked up and made known around the country, that kind of overlaps with this history. Contract buying was very popular in the 1950s and through the 1960s, and sort of ends when this period of redlining comes to an end in 67, 68, and the Fair Housing Act is passed. But without actually being able to attend to all of the problems that the federal government and the real estate industry had created in Black communities in the previous 30, 40, 50 years, without attending to those, then that is what shaped the kind of new market opportunities that African Americans had, that essentially continued the predatory practices without the explicit racial exclusion that had reigned in the previous period. But the outcomes are quite similar, which is financial exploitation, the continued degradation of African American communities, the physical degradation of properties in Black communities, and the continued extraction from African American renters and poor and working class homeowners. These patterns, which began in the redline period, continue in the post-redlining period, but within these new colorblind rubrics.
In about 5 minutes, we're going to open this up to questions. I do want to encourage everyone who's an attendee at the meeting to put your questions in the question and answer. I know there have been some comments about that on the chat, but if you want to get your questions in the stack, put them in the question and answer feature. And then, King, I wanted just before I sort of pass it over to the audience, to raise an issue, which is that housing is very contested. It's an issue which in Chicago right now, there's a lot of politics going on about, frankly. Representative Daley, I mentioned before that Delia Ramirez from House District 4 is proposing a COVID-19 emergency and economic recovery, Renter and Homeowner Protection Act. I think somewhere here I have the, it's gotten buried in the chat. I think somewhere I have, I'll give you the numbers when I find them, the numbers of that legislation. Oh, here it is. It's House Bill 5574. And then there's also a bill for lifting the ban on rent control, which is House Bill 255. And what those things would do is they would give 180 days of future relief to renters and owners and forgive some past due payments. So this is obviously, it's something which there's a lot of struggle over, partly just spurred by the fact there's a lot of now unaffordable housing in the city of Chicago. And then the COVID-19 is, underscoring that. I was hoping you might say something before we open it up to the audience about kind of how housing has been a place where where there's been political struggle and organizing, and some of the role that people fighting back have played in this issue, because it hasn't just been one-sided, has it?
Well, I just had published last week an article in the New Yorker titled "Cancel the Rent," which is about the issues of housing and COVID-19 and just what has come together in the last several weeks. And so housing was already emerging as an enormous political issue, really because of a lot of the problems that had been exposed in the 2008 financial crisis, the lack of resolution to those issues. And so in 2008, that was mostly centered around predatory lending, the subprime crisis, and really a wave of foreclosures that were unleashed in its aftermath. But it's connected to the crisis today, because we know that these multi-billion-dollar private equity firms bought up a lot of the homes of poor and working class homeowners in particular that had gone into default, and really took them out of the home ownership market and flipped them into high cost rentals. And so the number of African-American homeowners has shrunk. The rental market in general has grown. It's tight, which means that's part of how we understand the rising rates of rent over the last 10 years. So much so that something like 45%, somewhere between 40 and 45% of renters are what we call cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. Another 25% are extremely cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than 50%. And in some of the larger cities like Chicago, New York, Boston, San Francisco, those numbers are completely skewed, where we have many more people paying half of their income in rent. And this is part of the reason why this crisis has hit so hard for poor and working class people, because if you are paying so much of your income in rent, you have very little left over. And so when anything happens, when you have very little left over, it quickly unravels everything. And that's, there are tens of thousands of people, millions of people in this country who live paycheck to paycheck. And so a government mandate that we all shelter in place and not go to work has spiraled this crisis around housing out of control. And so many municipalities have imposed eviction moratoria, but that's just putting a pause on the eviction process. It's not
Right.
actually
So when the moratorium expires in August and you're
Yeah.
4 months behind in your rent, what are you going to do? Right.
Exactly. Or, you know, and I think Chicago is one of these places where you put a moratorium on evictions, but you don't stop landlords from filing evictions. So they're going ahead with the paperwork, waiting for the courts to open up so that they can start pushing people out. And, you know, pushing people out in the midst of a pandemic. You know, I end the article with the question, as a society, do we think people should be sentenced to death for missing a rent payment? And that's the reality of what it means when we say that the greatest protection that you have against this virus is to be at home. Then we cannot be putting people's homes in peril. So that's what the immediate struggle is shaping up around housing. That's what it's shaping up to be. And then there are the longer term questions about affordable housing and really creating housing that is not subjected to market pressures, and meaning that we need millions of units of housing where its price is not going up because of market pressures every year, but that is guaranteed and accessible to poor and working class people in cities across the country.
Keeanga, you've given everyone a lot to think about, but I want to bring some of our attendees in on the conversation. And I hope I don't butcher the pronunciation too badly, but the first person we're going to try to get a question in here from is Shalisha or Cocroft. No, wait.
Yes, I'm here.
Did I butcher your name too badly? Welcome.
You did, but it's okay. I understand it's for a good cause.
Say your name right.
Pronounce it.
My first name is pronounced Shalita. The last name is pronounced Cocroft.
Oh, Shalita. Okay, very good. Welcome. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I also have a background in Chicago. I taught for Chicago Public Schools for a number of years, and now I've moved on and entered the academy, and now I am a medical sociologist working for the University of Michigan, and have done stints at Duke University as well as Mass Gen in Boston. And my question is around the intersection between where you live, which is what your expertise is in, which I'm so excited about, and my expertise, which is healthcare delivery, right? And so I'm so frightened and disgusted by the parallels that you were describing from a historical perspective in terms of how policy led to the disenfranchisement of housing, understanding the intersection of housing and health. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how can we begin to close the gap and really try to have more intersectional conversations? Because we know that where you live impacts the health and how you recover from things like a pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that those conversations are being had currently in silos, and I believe it's our responsibility to kind of help people to understand that these are not mutually exclusive situations. We got to talk about housing, we got to talk about healthcare, we got to talk about education. We got to be able to have experts across these disciplines weighing in on this spectrum, right? That this pandemic is showing that we've got significant gaps in the systems as they relate to the United States in terms of the United States professing to be a superpower, according to the current occupant of the White House.
Got it. Keeanga, why don't you have a stab at that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the main thing is that lots of people understand this, and lots of people have been working on this and talking about this. But one of the problems that we have is that often the experiences of ordinary people are suppressed, hidden, invisible, not discussed or talked about. And so the media is sort of dominated by what happens in Washington and really what happens on top. And so one of the things that happens when there's a crisis that upends society, it inevitably pulls what is on the bottom to the surface. so that it's not hidden anymore and everyone is being forced to see it. And that in some ways is what this crisis has done. And there's an immediate attempt to push it back down. Like I'm on I'm on a committee in New Jersey that is organized by the governor's office of New Jersey for reopening the state. And, you know, I'm on one committee, there are 9 committees, and not a single one of these committees has anything about race. So a few weeks ago, every politician in the United States is having a press conference, wringing their hands about how horrible it is, these disparities are, how horrible it is that African Americans are disproportionately dying. Your mayor there, Lightfoot, was one of them, but not a single one of them are willing to actually do anything policy-wise to change that. So it's good to talk about for a soundbite, but in terms of actually implementing policies to do something, then they get very quiet. So what does that mean for our side? It means that outside of the immediacy of a crisis, it's political struggle and movements that force the people at the top to have to both listen to, see, and attend to these problems. And so that's why, you know, last fall when the CTU was striking over the immediate question of education, and housing is at the center of that, you know, the mayor is like, why are we talking about housing? This is about education. Well,
Right.
no, actually these things are connected, but because there was a political struggle that had the attention of everyone in the city and many people in the country, it brought attention to the connection between those two issues. So outside of the immediacy of a crisis, we have to have political action, organizing, and struggle as a way to not just make the connections clear, because for many of us they are clear, but then to put the necessary pressure on the political establishment to act accordingly.
Absolutely. Thank you, Keeanga, and thank you, Shalisha. Let's hear another question. Let's go to Keeanga Taylor now. Keeanga, welcome. You got a question for us?
You're muted.
Keeanga, you got to unmute.
I'm sorry, I didn't know. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can, yes, go ahead.
Okay, so my question is that what do like millennials, like African Americans that are in their 30s who want to live in their community do to prevent being in situations where you buy in your community, but you end up with property that has value that keeps on depleting?
Question.
That's a huge question, because there's segregation that is imposed on people, and then there is the ability for African Americans to constitute a community that has value, that means that people want to actually want to live there. The problem is a large one that can't immediately be resolved, because this is a reflection of the way race operates in the real estate market, so that it seems as if Black property and Black neighborhoods are diminished, and that is reflected in their value. And so I think that is part of the reason why we have to have both building and good housing produced in working class African American communities, and we have to have housing built beyond that that is also accessible and affordable, so that people have choices in where it is that they can live. And right now we're operating at a deficit, and not enough housing is being produced. And this is part of the bigger problem.
Thank you.
You're muted.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, I said. And next we're going to hear from Amaya Granville. Amaya? Amaya, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, but you're on if you want to ask your question. Amaya, you there? No, I guess we don't have her. Why don't we try Wade Grinstead? If we can get Wade Grinstead on to ask a question. There you go. Hey, Wade.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, you're on. Go ahead. Go ahead. You have a question for us.
Yes, thank you both so much for this important conversation. I'm curious, as a former classroom history teacher and as somebody who does work around social justice education now, I'm curious, you know, social studies and history teachers and other teachers, there's an importance for them to help support young people's learning about this undertaught or perhaps not at all taught history that you're talking about here in terms of housing segregation historically and the way it manifests now. Are there like voices of individuals and groups, voices of resistance, voices of resilience that you might highlight for educators to bring to the young people they work with? You know, I know there's the Black press and places like the Defender, you know, created awareness, but are there other examples of ways in which we can root the thinking about decision-making historically for our students so they can see the way those things manifest today?
Thank you. I mean, one of the things that I think should happen in Chicago in particular, since this history is so consequential to the rest of the country, is that in the same way that activists were able to win a curriculum around police torture in Chicago, that there should be curriculum around the history of housing segregation as a particular phenomenon in Chicago that had national consequences. There's a wealth of human and other resources in the city. There is, you know, a lot of archival information about Martin Luther King and the Chicago Freedom Movement's efforts to confront residential segregation in Chicago. People who were active participants in the Contract Buyers League, the organization of Black homeowners in the 1960s from the West Side and South Side who challenged the system of contract buying that and the exclusion of Black homeowners from conventional mortgages. Many of those who were active, or at least some of those who were active, are still living in Chicago. And over the last several years, there has been an incredible amount of research generated about the experiences of contract buyers. I think beyond that, you know, there are people who are doing, who continue to do organizing around housing injustice. I know that there are people who are working on organizing the rent strike and tenant unions in the city now. So there's no shortage of people to reach out to. There's just, you know, as with most of these things, there has to be an organized effort to bring this into touch with the students, connect this history with the students.
Yeah, I know that like there's a lot of teachers who are doing just that, and that's important. Actually, we're going to hear from someone next who I think is actually doing some organizing around housing issues. We're next to hear from Jesse Connor.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
All right, yeah, that was a very good transition point. So I'm actually an organizer with Autonomous Tenants Union, which is based in Albany Park. I want to also thank you for, you've linked to our website in that fantastic New Yorker piece with our response to Mayor Lightfoot's bad solidarity pledge. So thanks for that. Yeah, kind of what I wanted to ask, and more, I think, just to maybe for a point for you to hopefully kind of jump off on and kind of bring a historical perspective to, is the idea that doing, like in a city that is as segregated as Chicago is, when you're kind of doing anti-gentrification organizing, I feel like it presents this sort of unique opportunity where you are in these spots where that segregation starts to break down, even though it is breaking down because it's one group being pushed out. And I was wondering if you had any kind of perspective on just, you know, how that has worked, and if there's been instances of like broader, cross-racial solidarity organizing being done in places going through those circumstances, or just the importance of being able to build that moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the examples, you know, are few, but I think that they point to the potential. So, you know, they're the historical examples of the rent and eviction riots of the 1930s, where, you know, the Communist Party, which was one of the few integrated organizations in the city, was always ready or at the ready to defend mostly poor Black people who were being evicted from their homes in the midst of the Depression, to either move people back into their homes or to confront the forces of the landlord to prevent the eviction from being carried out in the first place. So, you know, that's one example. Then there's the example of the Chicago Freedom Movement, which also brought, I mean, most of these movements and activists are African American, but they also bring politically conscious and radical white people into the organizing as well. And that was certainly the case in the movement around tenant rights in the 1960s, much of which kind of sprang from both the contract buyers struggle, but also the Chicago Freedom Movement and the organizing that they described as unions to end slums, where the point was to organize people into collective bargaining agreements with their landlord, where rent would be based on the condition of the property. More recently, in the aftermath of 2008, when the Chicago Anti-Eviction Committee was formed, and then later the Communities United Against Foreclosure and Eviction, and then several other smaller groups on the South Side that weren't primarily organized on housing, but that did housing organizing. Also, you know, and the Occupy movement in 2010 and 11, you know, brought together people from different parts of the city against housing insecurity and to fight for housing justice. I mean, I think in all of these situations, the movement never formed into an actual movement. And so you would have demonstrations, organizing meetings, and that sort of thing, but it never really got much further beyond that, even though many of those actions were actually very effective. And so this is, I mean, it's part of the organizing challenge in a city like Chicago, but I do think that there's potential for that kind of multiracial organizing across the city, given the kind of onslaught of the attack that this virus has instigated. And so, you know, I think that the potential for both, you know, Black people, Latinx people, for politically conscious and radical white people to be able to ally on a number of issues that we will be challenged with in this coming period.
Good. Thank you. Let's hear from Karina Trudell next. Karina, if we can get her on to ask a question. Hey, Karina, welcome to the webinar. What's your question, please, Karina?
Hi, so I heard you discussing how evictions are currently on a pause, but essentially the eviction filing isn't. So does this mean that once the state, once that order is lifted, there would be an influx of evictions?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So everyone knows in Chicago, when you get your eviction notice, go to court, ask for a continuance, ask for a jury trial, and draw this shit out.
Yes. And
read the RLTO, the Residential Landlord Tenant Ordinance. It's one of the most liberal tenant rights documents in the entire United States.
You sound like you might know something about this, Keeanga. And participate in the movements that we're talking about. I mean, we're tweeting under the hashtag Chicago Housing, Race for Profit, and we're trying to push legislation which would drastically increase people's rights. We've been talking about that. There's a push for to do something about the ban on rent control, which is a statewide piece of legislation, obviously. So, we're trying to lift that ban, and that's House Bill 255. And then also Delia Ramirez from District 4 has a bill 5574, which would give 180 days of future relief to renters, people who own small mortgages, and forgive some of past due payments. So we're trying to, legislatively, we're trying to push that, and then obviously we're just trying to build activism. Check out the Autonomous Tenants Union. If you're a member of the CTU, please check out the Housing Committee, and please stay active on the issue. So with that shameless plug, thanks, Karina. Next I'm going to go to Amia Granville.
Wait, how can you tell? Oh, okay.
You're here. You're on.
Hi.
Hey.
Your book focuses on how racism in housing markets can lead to wealth being stolen from Black and Brown families. And as a student of color myself, I want to know your thoughts on how we can approach these racial inequities and make sure that minorities and majorities are on the same level when it comes to basic housing needs, considering that they will only continue to get worse during this pandemic.
That's a good question. Well, I think two things. One is that since 1968, the federal government has had a tool called the Fair Housing Act to actually combat racial discrimination in both in the lending, the renting, and the selling of property. And the problem is that from one administration to the next, whether it is Republican or Democrat, they have been all too unwilling to use that legislation. And so this is part of the challenge, which is compelling both on the federal, state, and local level and enforcement of fair housing to stop discrimination. And I think sometimes people think that, oh, that kind of discrimination doesn't really exist anymore. That there must be other explanations, but we keep getting reminded. There's a big bank called Wells Fargo that has been sued by several cities because of it was demonstrated through documented action that they targeted African Americans for more expensive loans, that they called Black people mud people, that they called the loans that they were targeting to Black communities ghetto loans. In Long Island, New York, the daily newspaper there just last November revealed the findings of a 3-year investigatory news search that real estate agents in particular discriminated against African American potential buyers 40% of the time. They discriminated against Latinx buyers 30% of the time, and that they discriminated against Asian American buyers. I think it was 20% of the time. So they showed that racial discrimination is actually quite pervasive in real estate in New York. You know, not somewhere in Mississippi or Louisiana, but in New York City. And so instead of it being the federal government doing those kinds of undercover investigation, it's been left to a news agency that has no political power to actually punish the illegal behavior that they uncovered. And so as long as the federal government is both reluctant to even, you know, use any of the fair housing tools it has, and then when racial discrimination is uncovered unequivocally, they're then reluctant to even, you know, to punish the offenders, then we're going to continue to have these sorts of problems. And so these are the things that also have to be integrated into our political demands. Is it really an end to racism in the practice of real estate and banking?
Thanks, Keeanga, and thanks, Amia. That me as a high school student in Chicago, so we're very happy to have students' voice. That's really important. You know, Keeanga, I wanted just to before I take the next question, who will be Paula Wyatt. I did just want to invite you to talk or think a little bit about. I mean, we're talking about quite a lot about activism. Can you say a little bit about kind of what the last big period of upheaval, especially around civil rights in the 1960s, what effect that had on housing and the kind of the political mood of the country on this issue?
Well, I think that for a long time, you know, housing had just been seen as kind of one of these issues in the backdrop. You know, you always talk about jobs, housing, education, but without really thinking about how consequential that is for people. And so in the 60s, you know, there were, as Black people were moving into cities from rural areas and from south to north, African Americans wanted to be homeowners because homeownership was upheld. This is part of what it means to be an American. And after Black participation in World War II and the migration, people's expectations about what U.S. society, what kind of lifestyle U.S. society should be producing for them grew. And so part of that is people wanted to be homeowners. And so that desire, which was met with one roadblock after another, was part of what radicalized African Americans over the course of the 1960s. You cannot call yourself the kind of beacon of democracy. You can't describe yourself as an affluent society and Black people's children are being mauled to death by rats. And that is not hyperbole. In the 1960s, there was a study, a test done for young Black students to identify various familiar objects. And more than 50% of them misidentified a rat as a teddy bear in Chicago. There was demonstration on the west side of Chicago that Martin Luther King attended, when a rat mauled to death an infant in its crib. And so these were the living conditions that African Americans were subjected to. And so it was not a surprise to any Black person that from 1963 through 1968, there were riots in more than 250 cities in the United States. More than 550,000 African Americans participated in uprisings across the US, which was more than the number of soldiers who served in Vietnam. So this was not an inconsequential number of people. And when the US government sent out people to interview citizens and neighborhoods who had participated in these uprisings, across all of the different cities they went to, they came to the same, they heard the same three issues repeated over and over and over again. They were, one was unemployment and underemployment, two was police brutality, and three was substandard housing. And so housing went from being a kind of window dressing issue that everyone talked about, but no one actually did anything substantively about it, to the kind of main political issues, so that by 1968, there is this huge omnibus housing bill passed, the Housing and Urban Development Bill of 1968, which for the first time was the federal government's effort to turn low-income renters into low-income homeowners, and it expanded all of the housing programs across the United States.
Thanks, Keeanga. All right, we've got Paula Wyatt next, and we're getting close to time that we have for this, and we're going to take Cook County Commissioner Bridget Gaynor after Paula. So, Paula, you have the floor. What's your question, please, Paula?
I have a question at a city level. If you were able to sit down with the planners and the policymakers at the city level, what are some recommendations that you would make that we could maybe try to mitigate the problems that you have been talking about? So what are some practical policies, if you got the ear of Mayor Lightfoot and you were able to say, try these things, what would you say to her?
Well, I mean, one is we're not going to solve the housing problems of Chicago, of Philadelphia, of Detroit on the cheap with, small local budgets. So we have to have the federal government, we need the scale of the federal government's involvement to deal with the financial issues involved in creating the type of housing that is discussed in the Homes Guarantee. For example, the proposal to create 10 to 12 million new units of housing that exist outside of the market. The Green New Deal for public housing that Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have talked about, which is about retrofitting the existing public housing with renewables, decarbonizing that housing, and really, this is public housing that has been allowed to deteriorate over the last several decades, is really revitalizing it so that it is brought back into the housing stock. So that's one thing. But I think on a city level, part of that discussion has to do with generating more income so that, or more revenue, so that we have the money and the resources to actually talk about equitable housing solutions. But I think as part of that, we have to create real affordable housing alternatives. Unfortunately, all too often, the quote unquote affordable housing that is discussed is not actually affordable for the people who need it. And so, you know, that's one thing. I think that, you know, there was a problem in Chicago with the Chicago Housing Authority for several years, just sitting on resources that it had available to itself, instead of using those resources to expand housing opportunity for people, just kind of sitting on those resources. So if there's a way to open the lists for vouchers and actually not have lists, but make those available for people. And then, you know, Chicago is one of the few cities that has a ordinance against discriminating against people who hold vouchers, but there's no enforcement. And I know that for a fact. I was a housing tester in Chicago and often called about renting apartments using a voucher, and was turned down because I had a Black sounding name. And so we need, as I was saying earlier, we need actual enforcement of fair housing laws so that we can use the tools that are currently available to us. But we need affordable housing for people that is not segregated in certain neighborhoods, as public housing historically has been done in the city of Chicago, but we need it across the city, and we need it to be genuinely affordable for people, not based on some computer formula that doesn't actually match up with the actual salaries and incomes of people who are in most need of housing in the city.
Thanks, Keeanga. It looks like Bridget has dropped off the call. Let's go to Michelle Ludwig next. Michelle Ludwig, there you go. Hey, Michelle, welcome. What's your question, please?
So my question is, and you've touched upon it a little bit, is, you know, we're living in this pandemic, and I feel like watching the news, you know, they're reporting these housing disparities, which many of us in education already knew about. You know, we're very aware about these disparities. And so I'm wondering, what do you think the short-term effects are going to be of this pandemic, and what might be some of the long-term effects? Like, what might we see in 10 years because of this pandemic and our housing disparities?
What might housing be like 10 years from now?
Yeah, especially for communities of color because of this pandemic.
Well, I mean, we don't know what things are going to be like 2 weeks from now. You know, I think that the trajectory of things is dim if we're just looking at the objective facts on the ground. But that's why what we do is important. I mean, that's why struggle is important. You know, it's not just about that landlords may be filing evictions, that those evictions will then be carried through. It's also, yes, they might be filing for evictions, and then, you know, other people may be organizing to challenge those evictions, both in court and beyond court. And so, you know, I think that if no one does anything, you know, then it'll probably look quite grim. But I think that's the organizer's challenge. You know, that's the whether you're in the union, whether you're in a grassroots organization, or whatever the site of your political organizing is, that's the challenge right now. Is how are we going to stop the worst possible things from happening?
Thanks, Keeanga. All right, I'm trying to keep my eye on the participants because Bridget was on and then she's off. I think she's back off again now. Oh, you're on.
No, I am.
Very good.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Very good. Bridget, thanks for joining us. Bridget Gaynor, County Commissioner. Bridget, go ahead. You've got the floor.
So first of all, I loved what you were saying. It's super interesting, and especially on the issues of the kind of morphing of what redlining ends up turning into, because it does evolve over time. One of the situations we have in Cook County is that properties become tax delinquent, and the only way they get out of tax delinquency if somebody chooses to buy them. But of the 25,000 in Cook County, you know, the vast majority that sit there, 85% of them actually are in African-American neighborhoods because they don't get bid on, but the process to kind of actually get them to an owner is almost impossible. And so what it does is it accelerates gentrification because the cost is so high. You're only going for those properties where your delta on what you buy it for versus what you sell it for. So East Garfield Park and Pilsen and places like that. And the process is so convoluted, you have to know it's intentional because these things don't happen by accident. And I wonder, as you explore, do you see that elsewhere? Because it feels like, you know, it was done very intentionally, and I don't know if any other jurisdictions figured out a better way to do that.
What is the it that was done intentionally?
So it's like they create a tax delinquency process through court and back taxes that it's impossible for the average person to ever get a house out of there without, you know, basically a law firm.
Right.
But the only people who bid on the properties, it's hedge funds and tax buyers. Right. And 99% of what comes out of there is in gentrifying communities.
Well, so my question is always, I know that different cities have some version of this, because as property taxes continue to, it's the only tax that, you know, city officials seem to not have a problem raising, and so, you know, that's a phenomenon that is happening to Black families and to Black neighborhoods in particular across the country. I live in Philadelphia. It's certainly a phenomenon here where there's a higher rate of poor homeowners in Philly than I think any other big city in the country. But because of the continued rise in property taxes, many of them are losing these houses that have been in their families for several decades. And, you know, once again, that the mayor of Philadelphia has already signaled that there's going to be a huge lift in property taxes to deal with this new deficit because of the disease. But the question I always have is, given that, I'm always confused as to why city or county officials don't act to change that type of dynamic, so that we can take some of these houses and give them to nonprofits, put them in community land trusts. It seems, you know, that people kind of accept, you know, over decades, these types of breakdowns without actually using some of the weight and authority that comes with public office to change it. You know, it's kind of just like watching the train wreck in slow motion. So that you know, that would be a question that I have about that.
Yeah, it's almost as if, like, you know, part of the precursor to gentrification is the allowing assets to just depreciate, drive them down, make sure that neighborhoods don't have any ability to cohere at all, tax sales, abandoned lots, etc. And only then can property be bought up on a cheap enough level to be able to get to justify capital coming back in and making those neighborhoods fix it up again.
It would seem like municipalities, like, people would be able to intervene before the bottom fell out, you know, like that's the question that I would have. Right. For people who actually wield power and authority in a city like Chicago.
Yeah, a lot of questions for people who wield power and authority, for sure. With ours, what we're trying to do is wield together some organization and some awareness. So we're really glad that people could join us. Keeanga, thank you so much for what's been a really fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
We're going to save out a little bit of time at the end. It's an important thing. Yeah, thanks everyone. Really great questions from the attendees, a lot of good participation. And I want to, at the end, turn this over to Jonathan Wilson, rank and file member at the CTU and teacher at Harper High School, and who's going to, and chair and activist in the Housing Committee, who's going to talk a little bit about some stuff that people can do next. Jonathan, it's up to you.
All right, thank you all for such a lovely discussion. I felt like you all were telling my life story. My family moved up from the South to Chicago, and then in the early 2000s, me and my mother were forced to move to Gary, Indiana from Chicago. So definitely, hearing all of those pieces put a lot of things into context. But yeah, I think, being in Chicago, we see the attacks on schools every day. We see the attacks on housing every day, and we see the attacks on Black communities every day. And now we see that COVID-19, that this pandemic is exacerbating the neglect and the racism we face, just like Katrina did with New Orleans. And so after witnessing this wonderful discussion, we've heard the problem. Now we have to organize. We've heard the issues. They've been laid out. Now we have to fight for the housing that our students, their parents, and our communities deserve. So join the Housing Committee, be a part of the strategizing and organizing that we must do to stop these racist attacks on housing. Unfortunately, only CTU members can be a part of the Housing Committee, but it's never too late to change your profession and become a teacher. So you can sign up and become a CTU member and be on the Housing Committee. But we do work with coalitions like Lift the Ban and the Right to Recovery. We do work with coalitions like Lift the Ban on Right to Recovery that are leading this fight. There have been many caravans, phone banks, mutual aid fundraising efforts that demonstrate working class solidarity, but more importantly, the need to organize and to fight back. The fight for mortgage and rent cancellation, there's a bill for that in the state legislature this week. So we need folks to join the Housing Committee, join this fight as we ready ourselves, to keep pushing back, keep resisting, and stop this trend of displacement.
Thank you. Anyone else from the host panel here who want to say anything as we head towards wrapping this up?
Yeah, just Jackson Potter. I'm over at Backyard High School and a member of the Chicago Teacher Union Human Rights Committee, and want to invite our audience today to join that committee. If you're a CTU member or if you're an ally and want to participate, let us know. We're trying to address how racism and white privilege show up in our school communities, whether it's in the form of curriculum, hiring, firing, how microaggressions take place with students or among teachers. But this is both at the school level, the district level. How can we have policies that will create a pipeline for teachers of color to come back to CPS, particularly since there's been such tremendous displacement of Black teachers? And at the city level, where we're going to need to fight for things like scholarships for our students to become teachers. So in any case, please consider joining the Human Rights Committee if that area of work interests you.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, well, I think that's it. I want to thank all the attendees. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor for a very interesting, insightful presentation. And I'll look forward to seeing you guys all out there in the movement. So thanks all, and have a good night.